there, we're here for Class 3 for Introduction to Judaism. Class 3 begins our week 2, even though it's on a Thursday. And in week 2, we're going to be looking at the earliest history of the Jews, so we can start to look at what religious contexts led to ancient Israelite religion, which eventually led to Judaism. Now, I am Holly, or Dr. Pierce, as you prefer. There's my contact information. Usually I have office hours via Zoom on Thursdays at 4, but not this week, as noted on the news feed for the course, which you should be checking in on periodically. But you can find me on Zoom next week at 4 o'clock on Thursday. Okay, so this week we will be looking at the very earliest history, quote unquote, the best we can do to piece together an origin, a root, a history of the people that would become the Jews. There is limited availability of detail and evidence for the earliest origins of the Jews, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. Actually, we're going to be looking at really before history, before evidence. There's no archaeological evidence to support, for example, the biblical origin story that we're going to be looking at mostly today. And we're going to be looking at the earliest forms of the religion, which is really pre-Judaism and not Judaism as such. It's the origins of Judaism. However, you'll understand it as we move on, I hope. Now, in class 4 next Tuesday, we'll be getting into history that we actually have evidence for, archaeological evidence and other forms of evidence other than the Bible, with more detail, more evidence, and we'll actually start to move into what we consider to be sort of recorded, accurate history by class 4. But today, it's all very nebulous. So for class 3, you were asked to read Satlow's Creating Judaism and Jaffe's The Jerusalem Temple as Ritual Center. Now, your first unit little paper is on the temple, so the Jaffe reading will be useful for that. You were also asked to read portions from the Bible that are essentially the key origin passages from the Bible. That's your primary text reading for this week. And I'm encouraging you, if you're interested, to just explore the first 5 books of the Bible and get a sense of the history and the law that's found in there, because being conversant with Torah is kind of a central thing to becoming comfortable with Judaism. So today we're going to focus a lot on biblical history, and we'll talk about how hard it is to put the term biblical with history like that. So, Judaism is a textual religion, as we've said before. That means that the text itself is a living presence within the religion, is a ritual object within the religion, and reading, studying, and reciting the text are rituals in of themselves, devotional rituals within Judaism. Judaism is also a textual religion because it is primarily the way to know God through God's revelation in the Bible, through the details that we get about God in the Bible. It is also the main source of legendary history for Judaism. It's a source of law and a source of education. Texts in Judaism really go to the heart of who we are, who the Jews are. The imagined community is really rooted in the distant past, the primeval and patriarchal origin stories that we're going to be looking at today. Now, the difficulty here is the Bible isn't written as history as we know history. We can read books of history now, and it's filled with citations and it's filled with evidence, and there's an attempt at objectivity and scientific accuracy within the text, or at least obviously biases, because history is often biased in its writing, but at least there's some attempt at verifiable accuracy. The ancient world did not view history in that way. History was story, it was narrative, in this case it was sacred story. It's not meant to be a scientific, accurate, objective record of what really happened. It's not history as we really recognize it today, and that's okay. It is legendary history. In many ways, it has a big T truth for believers that transcends accuracy and truth, historical truth as we know it today. What that means is not that we have to throw the Bible away as a source, but we have to take it with a grain of salt, and we have to sort of reconcile ourselves with the fact that even though it's not historically verifiable, these stories still have a foundational, paradigmatic, mythic relevance, a mythic resonance for the people who connect with these stories. So even though we may not have archaeological evidence to support this stuff, it's still important to go over it to begin with, because the Jews themselves view these stories as their origin. Today we're going to be focusing mostly on the Bible, even though this story is obviously relevant and is played with in other Jewish texts as well. If you haven't watched the earlier lectures in this course, go back and do so, particularly class 2, where we actually do go over the main sacred texts of Judaism. Okay, so the Bible itself, remember, Hebrew scriptures or the Hebrew Bible, not the Old Testament. The term Old Testament is used in Christian contexts, referring to Christian Bibles. The Jewish Bible is the Hebrew Bible, or the Hebrew scriptures, or the Tanakh, or the Mikra, but not the Old Testament. That is only to be used in Christian contexts, and this is not a Christian context. So the Hebrew Bible has 24 books as it was canonized by the rabbis. So most Jewish Bibles will have 24 books in them. They start out as scattered documents, scattered scrolls, compiled and edited and written by many, many hands over about 1,000 years. So, or more, from about 8th century to 5th century BCE is when we actually have the majority or the hearts of these texts actually being composed. The 5th century BCE, there is a major scribal editorial effort to bring the texts together, to reconcile the texts and produce better copies of the texts. And in class 4, we'll look specifically at why in the 5th century that was important, but it was during the Babylonian exile and directly after the Babylonian exile that the Israelites, becoming the Jews, decided that they needed to consolidate their texts. From about the 5th to 3rd century BCE, these texts, these scrolls, pretty much just circulated as separate books. And people, aside from probably the Torah, there was no set canon. It was very fluid. Around the 3rd century BCE till about 70 CE, we do start to see a canon forming, a de facto sort of communal agreement over which books are authoritative and important, but it's still fluid in this period. For example, at Qumran, there were no copies of the Book of Esther. It was just not considered a biblical book for the community at Qumran. Probably because the people at Qumran, the men at Qumran, were fairly misogynistic people, and the Book of Esther obviously features a woman and doesn't feature God. So it would not have been consistent with their communal values to have essentially a novel about a woman at a community like Qumran. So between 3rd century and 70 CE, the Bible is still very fluid. It's not a canon as such, but it's starting to become a canon, and certainly Torah was probably canonized much sooner than the rest of the Bible. From 70 CE till about 3rd century CE, the rabbis then undertook the job of selecting their canon, enforcing a canon, and discouraging the use of books that they considered to be not part of the Bible, or at least discouraging the inclusion of those books in other people's Bibles or Bible libraries. Because remember, these are still scrolls. In codexes wouldn't come along for quite some time. They're handwritten scrolls at this point. But from the 70 CE, the fall of the temple, till about 3rd century CE, we get a canonization process in which the Hebrew Bible, as we know it today, with the 24 books, are formalized. And throughout the Middle Ages, you get the production of authorized editions, authorized texts, some authorized translations, and most importantly, the Masoretic text, which is the official rabbinic Hebrew Bible in Hebrew with the Masoretic notation, including like vowels and things. So the Masoretic text was a process. It's a result of a really long process that starts in about 8th century BCE and ends in about 3rd century CE. So this is a long process. As such, then, we cannot expect that the Bible should act like a unified book, because it wasn't originally a unified book. So we do have sections within the Bible where things contradict each other, where we get different versions of the stories, where it can be a challenge to read the book as a whole, because there are times when the book disagrees with itself, because they were written by different people at different times, and different editorial hands played a role in there. Remember, ancient people didn't see authorship the way that we see authorship. When you pick up, a novel by like John Green or something, it has John Green written on the front, and you know who wrote it, and the author is a specific person. And yes, there are editors that help him polish his work, but they too are somewhat identifiable, and they don't add chapters and take out chapters. They're there to help him improve his work. The Bible wasn't written that way. Ancient editors and scribes, if they felt something needed to be added or changed or taken out, they simply did it. So before the advent of the Masoretic text, and to some extent afterwards, you have multiple different versions, all handwritten with slight differences. Words changed, lines left out, lines added. So the whole textual criticism of the Bible is a whole study on of its own. You can get whole graduate degrees on textual criticism, because it is so complicated. The history of the Bible, ways that people read the Bible and interpret the Bible and use the Bible, that's a whole field of study in its own right. But it's important for you to remember that as a source of history, first of all, the Bible wasn't written to be a source of scientific, objective history as we know history, and it wasn't produced in a very simple, cut and dry fashion. So it is challenging to use the Bible with any degree of accuracy and any degree of confidence when we talk about this earliest phase of history. But the Bible is obviously the main source of traditional parochial history within Judaism. So it's still really an important thing to study, to understand history from the perspective of the Jews themselves. The Bible, we can say that the Bible is presents history as a narrative of covenant. So it is a covenantal history. So it presents the narratives of covenants made, covenants broken, covenants lost, covenants renewed. This is one of the reasons why the Bible is not just plain accurate history. It is narrativized, particularly during the scribal efforts after the exile. It's narrativized as a series of covenants and their consequences. So Within these covenants, these series of covenants, you have a series of laws and agreements, you have the terms of the covenant, and oftentimes you also have examples, events where the covenant was broken, and the punishments for breaking that covenant, and then the renewal of that covenant. So it's a cyclical narrative rather than simply a bland record of things that happened. It is a covenantal story, a covenantal narrative, a covenantal history with scare quotes, I guess, if you want. Covenants lay out policies of membership and identity. They lay out loyalties. They lay out laws and penalties for breaking those laws. And this makes them not unbiased, unvarnished history, but rather a record of covenantal civilization. So we have 6 covenants, main covenants, that are one could argue that there's lots of other covenants going on in the Hebrew Scriptures, but there are 6 major covenants in the Hebrew Scriptures. The Edenic covenant, that is a universal covenant between God and all humanity through creation. The Noahide covenant, that is the covenant struck with Noah, again universal, applying to all humanity. The Abrahamic covenant, this is the covenant that is struck just with Abraham and the Hebrews, that his descendants, the Hebrews. So the Abrahamic covenant applies only to the Hebrews. So we go from universal to specific. And then the covenant of Sinai, which is a renewal and an adding on to the Abrahamic covenant for all of the Hebrews liberated in the Exodus as they are preparing to enter the land, the promised land, as it were. So again, specific. The Levitical covenant, covenant struck only with the priests, the descendants of Aaron, is even more specific. So it's for Hebrews, but it's only for Hebrew priests. And the Davidic covenant, which is even more specific, it's actually specified to one royal house, the house of David. So it's for Hebrews, but only royal Hebrews. So this covenantal history is in a series of overlapping agreements and loyalties and laws and penalties, and the narrative that goes along with them in terms of events of breaking the covenant and renewing the covenant. For Christians, of course, there is a 7th covenant, and that is the covenant with Jesus. That is not part of our concern in this course, because obviously that applies to Christianity. It does come into play for a handful of Jews over within different time periods, and we'll look at those as those are relevant. So the biblical origins of the Jews really lies in their covenantal relationship with God. The forming of covenants with God it lays at the heart of who claims the identity, who shares in the origin, and basically it's an inciting moment of when people became Hebrews, people became Israelites. So the biblical origins of the Jews really falls more into the area of myth or legend. And again, as an anthropologist, I'm not using these terms pejoratively. I'm saying it's not history as we know it. Myths or mythic stories provide foundations for cultural beliefs and self-identity and are incredibly important, but they're not quite the same as history. Legends we often define legends as stories that take place in the primeval time before historical evidence was a thing. So I think it falls more into myth and legend than it does in history. However, that doesn't mean that there is no truth to it. It doesn't mean that it is a lie. It doesn't mean that it is irrelevant. It just means that it's probably not historically accurate. Big T truth for the people who embrace these stories is still very much in play, and it's still something that we have to acknowledge. That for the Jews, their origins lay in the legendary stories of some major founding figures that existed before we have any type of historical evidence. So this week we're going to try to parse out what exactly we have historical and archaeological evidence for and what we don't, where we're only relying on the Bible to tell the story. Okay, so the traditional timeline, big emphasis on the traditional. I myself am a evolutionary biology freak, so I'm not particularly keen on young Earth. Big emphasis on the traditional here, but this is the traditional timeline according to if we were reading the Bible for the history of the world. Traditionally, often within Judaism, the creation is placed at about 4124 BCE, so that's year one within the Hebrew calendar. The flood is about 2469 BCE, so about that's year 1656 within the Hebrew calendar. The birth of Abraham is 2117 BCE, so it's 1948 for the Hebrew calendar. And the time of David is 1062 to 1022. And the temple era begins around that time of 1019 BCE, according to the traditional timeline. So the traditional timeline is a pretty good indication of how scientific knowledge doesn't necessarily mesh with more traditional ways of viewing time. Within Judaism, we do not have a long, passionate history of Judaism at war with science. Many Jews feel that science is actually a valid way of getting to know God because it allows us to know creation. So you'll have different groups of Jews, different families, different Jews themselves reconciling these things in different ways. So our context for our history today, because I kind of really am a historian at heart. So I did classics. One of my earliest phases of my education was in classical archaeology, and then I switched to biblical archaeology, which also overlaps with classical archaeology quite a bit. The Greeks and Romans were kind of all over that stuff. But this is our historical context here, the ancient Near East, what you'll often hear people refer to as the cradle of civilization. This is our geographic context and our historical context. The ancient Near East, or the ANE, is our vital context, and the majority of the Hebrew scriptures really focuses on this little corner of the world. So we have Egypt, we have Persia to here, we have the Hittites, we have the Phoenicians, the sea people who seem to have been Greek in origin, who basically give us the alphabet used in the area. We have the Babylonians and the Assyrians, the Canaanites, and the Hebrews, effectively. So the Mesopotamian region, the cradle of civilization, are this little fertile crescent between the Tigris and the Euphrates. But yes, here we have essentially what we call the ancient Near East. Now, the Mediterranean peoples of the Greeks and Romans will also be pretty key figures in the history that we're going to be covering today. So, in our little corner of the world, where the Hebrews begin as a tribal people, they seem to spring up out of an area that was basically filled with pagan tribal cultures of various ilks. Many different Semitic tribes of that area. The Semitic language and cultures all shared a lot of things in common, including, of course, languages. The Semitic language group sort of grows out of here. And there is significant cultural similarities between the early Hebrews and the Canaanites and others, for example. As Semitic tribes, they shared a lot in common. And, of course, the big cultures of Babylon and Egypt and Assyria and Persia, these were incredibly influential people in this whole area. So as we move through this history, we're going to talk about influences as well as historical events. So in the beginning, which is a great place to start, Genesis, the first section of Genesis is really primeval history. So Genesis 1 to 3 involves the creation of man according to Jewish tradition. So obviously, if you may have come across the story that within 7 days God created the earth, he created animals, and then he created humans to inhabit the earth. He told everyone, animals, plants, and people, to go forth and multiply and be happy, essentially, and cover the earth. And then Adam and Eve made a mistake. They ate the forbidden fruit and were cast out of the garden. And in that process, their lives were made harder because God no longer delivered their basic needs free of charge, because they lost that privilege, having broken the rules. So within this, we get the Edenic covenant, that is that humans are to live in the earth and be fruitful and multiply, and to take care of the earth. And in exchange for God having created the earth for our use. So the role of God in humanity is established, with God as creator and humans as being sort of like God, but not God. Now, an important note here, Judaism doesn't have a doctrine of original sin. Humans weren't all damned because Adam and Eve did that sin. Our lives are harder as a result of them not keeping the Garden of Eden, but we're not all born sinful because of the sin of Adam and Eve. Now, here again in Genesis 1 to 3, we get some scribal interference. There are inconsistencies in the story. For example, at one point, God made man and woman at the same time. In another instance, in the same passage, he created man and then created woman from man. And it is quite conceivable that different Jews had different versions of the story, and just somehow both of them ended up in the Bible. So we see in this passage the nature of God as creative and as just and merciful, but also as a strict parent, and who sometimes has to punish his creation. It establishes many powerful paradigms that still exist today. For many people, the Adam and Eve story, because Eve took the apple first and then gave it to Adam. For many people, the Eden narrative establishes a paradigm of patriarchy, that men are supposed to rule over women. But it also establishes a paradigm, an equally powerful and very good paradigm, that all humans are related, that we're all created by God. There is a basic unity to humanity. So any of the later stories that seem to divide the Hebrews from everyone else is somewhat tempered by the fact that God is the creator to everyone, and God is a parental figure to everyone, and the Edenic covenant applies to all humans and not simply to the Hebrews. Continuing with primeval history in Genesis is Noah and the Great Flood. Now, this comes with the covenant with all of the nations. So Noah's covenant, which is basically establish a rule of law, don't steal, don't kill, respect life, and so on, and I won't destroy the earth with another major flood. So that's the Noahide covenant. We see in Genesis 6 to 9 the story of the flood. And the story of the flood basically is God looked down, humans were doing things that he didn't approve of, and he decided to wipe it clean with a remnant surviving so they could restart. And the remnant that survived was Noah and his family, who Noah built an ark, and he took upon it the animals that would be needed to restart creation, essentially. And after this, God promised not to do this again. Now, the Great Flood story is something we see in most ancient Near East or in mythologies. Great Flood seems to be a recurring theme. Whether this actually refers to a flood that was experienced in the distant past in this area, so therefore it became part of their mythology, or whether this just reflects a desert people and their obsession with water and their fear of flash flooding, because any places, wadis, for example, dry riverbeds, can flood very quickly and can be quite catastrophic. It's unknown why so many ancient Near Eastern cultures have flood themes in them, but it's pretty consistent throughout the region. It's also possible that it all springs from the very earliest cultural expressions in the area, and then everyone who descended from those earliest cultural expressions took the theme with them. Now, the flood gives us themes of what happens when humans disobey, and sometimes that can lead to collective guilt and collective punishment. So God destroyed all of humanity basically because of the sinfulness of humanity. So it shows the anger of God and the wrath of God in this story, but also the restraint of God. He could have just killed all of humans and literally restarted them, but he left a remnant. And the theme of wrath, restraint, and remnant are also themes that we see a lot throughout the Hebrew scriptures, because one of the big promises made to the Hebrews is that there would always be a remnant left of the nation. So from Noah has a son Shem, and from Shem comes the Semites. Now, 10 generations later, we have Abraham, the original patriarch. So now we move from primeval history to what you could call like ancestral history. And the majority of Genesis is really about this beginning of the Hebrews. So Genesis 12 to 50 looks at Abraham, his life story, not even his life story, because he's an old man when the story really begins. But Abraham, all we're really told about Abraham is that he was from Ur of the Chaldeans, so he was Chaldean. No one is really 100% sure what that means. Chaldean later refers to Aramaic speakers. But he becomes essentially the father of the Hebrews by agreeing to a covenant with God that he would make a new people. He would make a break with his father's idol-worshipping culture and start a new people. And in exchange for his devotion to God, which he would signify through circumcising himself, he was promised descendants. And he quite famously laughs at this because he's an old man and his wife is an old woman and they have no children, so where are these descendants going to come from? And God provides descendants for Abraham and Sarah, his wife, quite miraculously. And herein lies sort of the national origin of the Jews. It also ushers in obviously the importance of circumcision as a ritual of identity that still exists today. The circumcision of male sons is still a mark of Jewish identity. Now, it also ushers in the era of the patriarchs. Patriarchs seem to be male heads of households that functioned as heads of households, but also clan or tribal leaders, as well as the main sacrificial officiants for their families. If we look at the book of Job, Job's function is a patriarch of his family. He makes sacrifices for his family. So we can extrapolate from this that the very earliest Hebrew religious practices involved the father having their own altar to God for each family. So we start to get the picture of a religion that is heavily sacrificial in nature and heavily autonomous, with many different altars and animal sacrifices being made to God within individual families. So from Abraham, long story short, the 12 tribes descend from Abraham, and Joseph ends up in Egypt. And in Egypt, he flourishes. He invites other Hebrews to come to Egypt, and eventually their numbers grow too big, and Pharaoh enslaves them. He's worried about rebellion, so he decides to kill all of the firstborn Jewish males, or Hebrew males rather, and a baby, Moses, survives, and he's floated down the river, and he's adopted by Pharaoh's sister. He's raised within the royal household, and he becomes educated as a nobleman. And then one day, adult Moses, who is a Hebrew in disguise, perhaps in disguise, maybe they all recognized he was a Hebrew, it's not really specified in the story. But one day he notices an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave. He gets angry and he kills the Egyptian overseer, which leads to his exile to Midian. Now, amongst the Midians, he gets married. He embraces God, and then is visited by God through the burning bush and told to go back and deliver his people from slavery in Egypt. He tries, well, first of all, he says no, but God insists. So he's like, fine, I'll go do my duty. And he goes back to Egypt, and he tries diplomacy. He tries demanding the liberation of the Hebrews. He tries signs and wonders, but Pharaoh says no. So through Moses, God brings 10 plagues upon the Egyptians, which inspire the Pharaoh to say, you know what, get out, go, take whatever you want and just go. So then we have essentially the Passover story, where the Hebrews are liberated from Egypt, wander in the desert for 40 years, and then eventually come to the promised land that was promised to Abraham and re-promised to the Hebrews as they were liberated from slavery. There's a quick and dirty version of the story of Exodus. So we here have a story of liberation, in which the Hebrews again become the possession or the property of God, because God heard their cries and he gave them liberation and the land flowing with milk and honey, in exchange for rededication of the Hebrews to be his nation, the nation of priests. And as a result of this covenant, we are given Torah. We're given 613 commandments. I know the 10 commandments is catchier, but 613 commandments as basically the terms and conditions of the covenant. Moses is, along with Abraham, these are two of the major founding figures of Judaism before history begins. So you have Abraham, and then you have Moses. Moses is probably closest to the founder of pre-Judaism as we can get, because he is intercessor. He speaks for the Hebrews, not only to the Egyptians, but also to God. And he's also the lawgiver. He brings the law, and according to tradition, wrote Torah. So Moses is a major founding figure, but he's the intercessor. He's the person who makes the covenant at Sinai on behalf of everyone liberated from Egypt as they are moving into the land of milk and honey. But he is himself forbidden from entering the land. So we have 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. While the older generation dies off, while the nation has a time to purify itself, and then finally the conquest of Canaan, the entering of the land of Canaan. So we have crossing of the Red Seas, to leave Egypt. We have wandering for 40 years, and then finally the entering of Canaan. Now, this is the story that is told in the books of Joshua and Judges. We don't actually have any historical evidence whatsoever that the Exodus or the conquest of Canaan occurred. We'll talk more about this in class 4, but essentially these are big events that we would consider there to be some evidence of. There's some evidence of burning in the ancient ruins of Jericho, but nothing suggesting a mass invasion of the type that we see in Joshua. And this actually may be because Joshua and Judges actually give us different versions of this story. In the book of Joshua, it's a massive military campaign where they are able to weaponize the Ark of the Covenant and basically vaporize people and pull down the cities. Defeating the pagan Canaanites for the sake of the Hebrews. In Judges, sorry, I've got a tickle in my throat that will not go away. In Judges, we get a version of the story we get a version of the story in which the Hebrews buy land, and through the virtue of diplomacy and treaty making, just settle in the land of Canaan. That version of the story is actually much more consistent with the lack of historical evidence. I promise it's not COVID. It's just a tickle in my throat. My throat is not adapting very well to the return to lectures. So, traditionally, this is about so traditionally, the story of Canaan is one of victory, and it's one of a oppressed people finding their own autonomy, and it's a story about covenantal renewal and God keeping his promises. But it's problematic to use the Bible as a source here because there's inconsistencies with archaeological record, and there's inconsistencies within the Bible itself. But now we start to actually move into an area that is on much more solid historical footing. And this is that we see developing within this area a confederacy of the tribes of Israel. And now we start seeing the Hebrew identity being expressed through a sort of loose union or confederacy of 12 different tribes that don't seem to be all that different from the other Semitic tribes of the area. And they seem to organize themselves as sort of almost a clan system, with a chief or a judge or a general leading the individual tribes, but an agreement amongst the tribes in terms of a shared origin, some sort of shared allegiance and loyalty amongst the tribes. This is actually pretty consistent with the story of the patriarchs, where the patriarchs essentially are clan chieftains who are seen as leaders of their small band. And it's easy to see how that could move into a tribal clan system as we see here. Now, we do actually move into verifiable history now with the monarchical period, the period of Saul, David, and Solomon in the 11th and 10th century BCE. So the conquest of Canaan, if it occurred, was probably about 1400 BCE. And now we have the Davidic kingdom. We call it the Davidic kingdom, even though it's Saul, David, and Solomon, because David was really the star of that triad. In the 11th or 10th century, it's often seen sort of as the glory days of early Israelite civilization. It is about as powerful as the Israelites got, really. So during this period, the monarchical period, the 12 tribes unite under a single king. They expand their territory to their greatest extent. The capital of Jerusalem is established, and the single temple is built. David builds the altar, and Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem. And all of these things mark a very stark contrast with all of the primeval history and the patriarchal history that we see before it and what comes after it. So the fact that Israel becomes a kingdom under a head with a capital and a temple starts to progress ancient Israelite religion towards what we would know as Judaism. David, as the anointed king, he was anointed by the prophet Samuel, becomes the prototype for the Messiah, or the anointed leader, the leader that's anointed by God as the rightful head of Israel. And it is with David that the Davidic covenant is formed. After Solomon, after his son Solomon, the kingdom divides again, with not so great consequences. But for a brief period under Saul, David, and Solomon, all of the tribes were united, and it's often looked to sort of as the glory days, if you will. So what are we talking about here when we talk about religion going on here? When do we start using the term Judaism? When do we start using the term Jews? Not in this period at all. When we're talking about the period of the patriarchs and the 12 tribes and of even the monarchical period, we're actually talking about ancient Israelite religion, often sometimes referred to as AIR, but I don't. I generally refer to it as ancient Israelite religion. And this is different from Judaism. Judaism comes later. Judaism is, in a sense, a consolidation and an invention, a renovation, if you will, a project that occurs during the exile and slightly after the exile, the Babylonian exile, which we'll get to in class 4. In this period, we're still looking at ancient Israelite religion. It's sacrificial in nature, it's temple-based, but people embraced the central one temple in Jerusalem at different levels. There were still people sacrificing outside of Jerusalem right up until after the exile. Religion at this point is still very, very fluid. It's still very similar to Canaanite religion. It's not reformed as we see under Ezra and Nehemiah after the return from the exile. So at this point, we're still talking about Hebrews, we're still talking about Israelites, and we're still talking about ancient Israelite religion, or even Hebrew tribal religion, if you want to refer to it as that. I prefer ancient Israelite religion because it covers everything pre-Judaism. But there is definitely a relationship, obviously, between ancient Israelite religion and Judaism. And that is, Judaism is created out of many of the themes established within ancient Israelite religion. But here's one of the big differences. Remember when in class 2 or 3, when I put that little asterisk beside monotheism? Yeah, ancient Israelite religion wasn't monotheistic. Monotheism means the worship of one God, the acknowledgement of one God, the belief that there is only one God. Ancient Israelite religion, for the most part, worshipped only one God, but they believed other gods existed. It's very much in an ancient mindset of, yes, there are lots of different gods, but my God is best. And that is actually henotheism, not monotheism. Henotheism, Henotheism. I don't teach spelling, but it's something like that. Henotheism is the worship of one God, even though you acknowledge the existence of many. Monotheism is, generally speaking, the belief in only one God. Early ancient Israelites believed there were lots of different gods. They just believed theirs was the best. In contrast to the rest of the Semitic tribes that were polytheistic, and they obviously polytheistic worshipped many gods. So we get a move, presumably from polytheism before the advent of the Hebrew religion, into henotheism in ancient Israelite religion, and into monotheism in Judaism, and particularly ethical monotheism in later Judaism. Ethical monotheism is the belief in one God, like all monotheisms, but it also means that you believe in a good God who also cares if you're good. Ethical monotheism has an emphasis on not just sacrifice, but also like ethical behavior. So ethical monotheism is eventually where Judaism ends up, but it goes through this process first, from polytheism before the change in Hebrew self-understanding as belonging to God, into henotheism, which is the worship of one God, but the acknowledgement that other gods exist, and into monotheism, with an emphasis on sort of ritual purity, less emphasis on ethics, perhaps, and into ethical monotheism, with which is the belief in one God, and that belief in one God necessitates a certain ethical or moral standard. So ancient Hebrew and Israelite religion was a lot more like Canaanite religion. It was very fluid, it was sacrifice-based, and it was dodgy in terms of its relationship to monotheism. So it is vastly different than what we see in Judaism, where monotheism basically becomes not optional, and Judaism purifies its ritual to focus on one temple rather than home-based altars. And it starts to include more of the things that we recognize in Judaism, like communal prayer, study and recitation as rituals, and things of that nature. So the earliest religions of the Hebrews and the Israelites are better referred to as ancient Hebrew and Israelite religion than it is Judaism. There is a relationship, but I'm not sure we would recognize ancient Israelite religion as Judaism if we were plopped down in it. There are massive changes that occur. It's henotheistic, it's sacrificial based only, and it's fluid, and it's more autonomous. Each individual household or each individual community leaders probably had a lot of influence on how the religion was practiced day to day. For example, in ancient Israelite religion, we see much more of a divine feminine worship of Asherah, the god's counterpart, female counterpart, for example, they're still talking in the Bible, in the monarchical period, still talking about trying to get rid of the divine feminine in these texts. And one of these is that the temple at Jerusalem was the temple that housed the official priestly class, those engaged with the priestly covenant, the descendants of Aaron, the Levites. There were competing temples. Even though David established the altar in Jerusalem and said this is the altar to the one God, and Solomon built the temple for the purposes of housing the one God, there were competing temples before the advent of Judaism. So this the Levites represented sort of a hereditary priesthood with an oral teaching. That oral teaching becomes perhaps the descendant of the Mishnah. Now, the first temple, as I said, David established the altar at Zion, but only his son was allowed to build the temple. David was a man of war, so he was not allowed to build the first temple, according to the Bible. But his son Solomon, being a wise person, being a man of letters, and not being a man of war, was actually able to build the first temple. From what we gather, we're looking at 180 feet long, 90 feet wide, 50 feet high. Very lavish and impressive building. Established around 957, give or take. Could be a little bit earlier, could be a little later. This temple included the Holy of Holies here. Now, the second temple, and we'll get to why there's a first temple and a second temple, the Holy of Holies here reportedly held the Ark of the Covenant. So the original tablets from Moses, written by God, was housed within the Holy of Holies. However, in 587, when the Babylonians took Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, the Ark of the Covenant was lost. If you are an Indiana Jones fan, that you'll know a bit of that story, but generally speaking, it is believed that it was just melted down by the Babylonians. The second temple, which was built a little bit later, and we'll look at the building of the second temple, I think in class 4, the second temple actually just had an empty Holy of Holies, which is actually kind of a sad image. So this is the first temple, also sometimes referred to as King Solomon's temple. So the rituals of the first temple were focused largely on sacrifice, particularly animal sacrifice, blood sacrifice, involving the blood, the fat, and the meat, particularly the burning of the blood and the fat and the meat, and the rising up of the smoke to God. So in that sense, it's very consistent with ancient Near Eastern religious practices overall. Other offerings were given: incense, wine, oil, water, fruit, grain, foods, particularly in the form of cakes, and ritual songs were also offered up. The temple was the center of covenantal maintenance and renewal. So it was the focus of the place where the Hebrews or the Israelites could show their devotion to God, pay their respects to God, in order to continue the blessings and the covenantal renewal that allowed those blessings to come. So it was the source of prosperity and fertility and abundance and protection and power and status and being able to keep the land. It was also a major source of identity. Like those who were allowed into the temple, those who were allowed to make offerings at the temple, that was the core of what it meant to be an Israelite man, is your ability to interact with the temple. Those Israelites who lived outside of Jerusalem would actually ingather to the temple, so it was also a way in which populations could mingle and people could make pilgrimage to sort of shore up and affirm their Israelite identity. And we also see in the first temple the beginning of symbolic offerings. Songs, yes, but psalms. The psalms, from what we gather, many of them started as prayers or songs that were sung at the temple. So we start to see the beginning of the offering of the tongue, to the offering up of prayer and song, and not just animal offerings. So the roots of later Judaism is starting in here. For example, never mind. I don't want to get off track and lose track of time here. But the first temple is an exotic, different way of practicing Judaism. It's not Judaism as we would call it, but the echoes of Judaism is already visible in here. So the temple means a lot of different things. It is literally a dwelling place for God amongst his people. So it's a home, it's a shelter for God, for the kavod, sort of the glory or the presence of God on earth. And it's particularly a dwelling place for God in the presence of his sacred nation. God doesn't need a home on earth because he created earth, so his presence can be everywhere. But the temple offered a specific place for God amongst his people, at the heart of the nation. It was said to have been sort of a replica of heaven. That's why it was so lavish and beautiful. And this is supposed to show the glory of heaven, show the glory of God. It was meant as a font of holiness, of power, so the Spirit of God, the power of God could emanate throughout the nation from that heart. It was a symbol of the power of the priesthood and of the one priesthood. It was a place of communication with the sacred. It was a nexus of communication where humans could have a sort of a direct line or a nexus to communicate with the divine. The altar itself was essentially a telephone. It was a mode of communication with God. And it was a symbol of the cosmic order. So it was the center of creation, the nexus where humanity and the divine could touch. And it sort of laid out the cosmic order, that this was the heart of holiness, and the further you got from it, the less holy the world got. Becomes a pilgrimage center for people living outside of Jerusalem, which allows them to firm up their identity, and also allows the nation to take census and to keep stock of their numbers and how well they're doing. And as such, it also plays a really important economic role. It was a tourist destination for Israelites, but not just Israelites. People from around the ancient world were already doing the tourist thing, and so you could make money off the temple. The temple was an economic power, and a lot of people who were lucky enough to build shops and stalls and restaurants around the temple made money off the presence of the temple. We can never, you should never completely disconnect religion and economics, because religion plays a major economic role. And it is the covenantal core. So it stands as a physical reminder of the covenantal relationship of the history, the peoplehood, the identity of the Hebrews in relationship to God. So it is both a monument to the covenant as well as a means to satisfy the covenant. And as such, it also serves as sort of a moral compass for the community. It displayed the grandeur of the kingdom, and yes, reflected well on the king. King Solomon's two great achievements really was the building of the temple and the building of his palace. So his rule was made greater and stronger and more impressive by his building projects. And as such, under David and under Solomon, the one temple was symbolic of the unity of the people and the unity of God. As the heart of the entire nation and of the diaspora, the reason the powers that be were so engaged with trying to get all Hebrews to worship at the one temple is because they felt if you have one God, you should have only one temple. And maintaining only one temple is a way of enforcing monotheism. Other Hebrews had different ideas. There were many rebellions from this, and we do have records of temples popping up all over the place and competing with the temple at Jerusalem. But the point, the symbolic point of the one temple is that we are one people, we have one temple where we worship one God. So the oneness of the temple and of God becomes increasingly important to ancient Israelite religion as it attempts to reform itself into a monotheism, and it's definitely important to the creation of monotheism, an ethical monotheism that is Judaism after the exile. So the temple is really important. It's not just about the priesthood and the rituals that take place there. There's a lot of symbolic and metaphorical meanings to the temple. The temple, it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. So when we talk about Hebrews, we're talking about the descendants of Abraham. When we're talking about the Israelites, we're talking about the tribes at Sinai and into the land. When we're talking about ancient Israelite religion, we're talking about all of the forms of religion that occur before the Babylonian exile. And when we talk about Judaism, we're talking about what happens after the Babylonian exile. And it is after the exile that we talk about Jews and Judaism. And we will talk about that in class 4. So, in class 4, to give you a little preview of what we're going to be talking about, Judaism and Jews really refer to the Yehud. This is the Persian province of Judea. Because after Solomon, the irony is, sadly, that Solomon didn't just build the temple because he was wise and blessed. He also managed to build the temple because he taxed the 12 tribes and enforced mandatory unpaid labor on the 12 tribes in order to build the temple. So Solomon was not a particularly popular guy because of the taxation and because of the forced labor. He couldn't hold the monarchy together. So while the temple united the tribes, ultimately it was part of the reason it fell apart. And we get the dissolution of the united monarchy into the tribes of Israel, which are 10 tribes, and the kingdom of Judah, which are 2 tribes, Judah and the Levites. And Judea keeps Jerusalem, and Israel now sets up a capital in Samaria. And quite famously, the tribes of Israel, the 10 tribes of Israel, are completely lost to Assyrian invasion in 722 BCE. And they basically disappear from historical record. They're carried away into bondage, according to history, according to legend. They were carried away into Assyria, became slaves or assimilated. Some probably fled as refugees into Judah, and were just absorbed into the province of Judah. So this is a pretty major catastrophe in 722 BCE. Half the kingdom, half the nation of Israel is effectively lost. In 586, the kingdom of Judah is taken by the Babylonians, and there occurs the Babylonian exile, in which the elite of the kingdom of Judah is taken into exile into Babylon, but they're returned by the Persians in 539 BCE, and they rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and that becomes what we refer to as the Second Temple. And it is when they return under the Persians into the Persian province of Yehud that we really start seeing Judaism occur, and we generally start to use the word Jew and Judaism, because it is returning to the land after the exile, in which the leaders, particularly Ezra, but also Nehemiah and the leaders of the Sanhedrin, undertake a massive project to not just rebuild the temple, but to purify Judaism as a religion, and gives us what we can identify as Judaism, with mandatory Sabbath, mandatory kosher laws, prohibition of intermarriage, the mandatory gathering to recite Torah, the emphasis on prayer as well as sacrifice, because the temple is rebuilt, an emphasis on leaders and the interpretation of the law, an emphasis on the getting rid of what they considered to be pagan influences. That was the reason for their downfall. And another major factor is basically the introduction of Aramaic. So the world becomes, or Judaism becomes, more like what we would recognize today. And I think that's all we're going to talk about today, because on class 4 we're going to we'll go into more depth about all of these changes. But it is at this point, in about 539, the Bible is formed and Judaism becomes a thing. So we switch from using the term ancient Israelite religion, and then we switch to Judaism at this point. Okay, so we'll look at that more on class 4, because I really need to get this video posted. I'm posting it early for Thursday. Okay, so your assignments, upcoming test on October 5th. I think I found it today in a typo where at one point it said October 6th, but the test is indeed on October 5th, so please keep that in mind. And your first paper, little paper, unit paper, which the instructions are already up, is due on October 8th, and that is on the temple. So please remember, the first post for week 1, if you haven't done it yet, you still have until September 22nd to do it, but please do it this week. And your discussion prompt for week 2 is to define these terms: Hebrews, Israelites, as opposed to Israelis. That's kind of a rookie move. It happens in papers all the time. People mean Israelites and they refer to Israelis, which is a bit confusing. Jews, ancient Israelite religion, and Judaism. How do you use those terms? Do you know how to use those terms appropriately? It will strengthen your research and writing on these topics if you know how to use these terms appropriately. Also, you don't have to talk about this in your forum post, but you should also keep in mind how to use Hebrew scriptures and Old Testament, because that is also really important, and for your papers also will be pretty important to use Hebrew scriptures and not Old Testament when you're in a context of studying Judaism. Okay, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, please email me. Again, my office hours are canceled for this week, but I'll be back with regular office hours next week. You can email me and I will get back to you as soon as I can. I hope you have a good weekend and a solemn and efficacious Yom Kippur to those who celebrate. And I will see you again on Tuesday. Bye for now.